Happy Heritage Day to you all. And I think it's also important that you have your Heritage Day at the same time that you have got this Indigenous Epistemologies seminar series. So there is a kind of correlation of the day and what you are doing this week. My presentation is on Indigenous Epistemologies and decolonizing higher education in Africa. So I think indigenous knowledges are very important because they are what we can describe as the intellectual history and the lived experiences of indigenous African people. These indigenous or African indigenous knowledges are based on experiential knowledge, which is also a focus on the world view and a culture that's basically rational. In other words, we can use indigenous knowledges for everyday life practices, and African people use it because it makes sense to them. Therefore, it's very rational. And like Odora Hopper says that indigenous knowledges themselves also a kind of a template that shapes African values, the behavior of the people, and their consciousness within their societies. And these forms of knowledges are passed from generation to generation. So you'll find that I use the term knowledges instead of knowledge because indigenous knowledges are not just one type of knowledge. There are different types because they are also found in different societies and apply to different groups of people. Therefore, there's no one indigenous knowledge, but systems of indigenous knowledges. And while people talk of indigenous knowledge as traditional knowledge, I agree with Zenge and Wambe who said, well, there are systems of knowledge which are better appreciated as changing. They change, they do not remain the same. Therefore, they depend on how the people experience their lives and how they see changes in their lives. So the indigenous knowledges are not the same all the time, they change. And they are also practical and collective and belong to the community. They don't belong to individuals such, like we find in Western societies, where someone comes up with knowledge and that knowledge is acknowledged to be belonging to that individual. But for indigenous knowledges, they are communally owned. They belong to the communities. But what we also know about indigenous knowledge is that they benefit from other cultures. So because they change, they can also adaptable. They can take from other cultures. As much as non-African knowledge systems have also survived through borrowing from African knowledges. But what we should be careful about is the cultural appropriation of African indigenous knowledges. I will give an example of the South African Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, which somehow, from my own understanding and from Sam's way of seeing it, dubiously patented there without observing the basic indices of geographical indications, how they belong to the community. And they took the indigenous knowledges and accessed it and shared it, and even not look or ask for consent from the indigenous people who own the knowledge itself, and they used it to form some kind of rights that they gave to the phytofarmers, the pharmaceutical company that then produced Wodia and patented it without going back to the communities. So it was a kind of cultural appropriation which was commercialized, but not being used to give it back the benefits to the communities. So maybe you are aware of what happened with Wodia in South Africa and in Namibia. What should happen is to protect indigenous knowledges and to provide community benefits. Whenever indigenous knowledges are being used, they should benefit the community and the people from which the knowledge is being taken. For example, what happened in Guinea, West Africa, where shaman pharmaceuticals, which are based in San Francisco, collaborated with 58 traditional doctors, 7 provinces, and 42 communities in Guinea, West Africa, between 1994 and 1998. And that collaboration resulted in 145 plant species which were identified, and these were found to be useful for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Guinea's traditional healers, botanical medicines, were highly acknowledged by the pharmacy, and the healers' contributions were recognized in that research. Therefore, the recognition of the traditional healers indicates that the shaman pharmaceuticals itself acknowledged that it was not their knowledge, but people's knowledge. So this is what should happen whenever indigenous knowledge are being extracted and being used. The society and the elders within the communities benefit from it. So the purpose of my presentation is to advance what I describe as the colonizing cultural critique and an African discourse that argues for a reclamation of African culture and indigenous knowledges in higher education in Africa. When you talk of decolonization, we're talking about the deconstructing of colonial ideologies or Western ideologies that seem to see themselves as superior to our African thinking and thoughts and processes. So Western thought and approaches seem to privilege themselves over African traditional way of life and way of thinking. Decolonization also entails that we must dismantle structures that perpetuate status quo and addressing unbalanced power dynamics. Unbalanced power dynamics between how African indigenous knowledges are presented and how African knowledges, which are defined as science, are presented. So decolonization also seeks to value and revitalize indigenous knowledge and approaches, and weed out colonial assumptions that have impacted indigenous ways of being. So when you look at the World Talk, it will focus on trying to talk about how, despite political decolonization, the higher education system in Africa is to a large extent still a mirror image of the inherited colonial education system. And my argument is that it lacks indigenous cultural capital and habitus. That includes indigenous knowledge themselves and indigenous sciences. And I also argue that implementing indigenous knowledges and sciences in higher education assists students, higher education teachers, parents, and communities to reclaim their voices in the process of educating the African child and in socio-cultural development. Indigenous knowledges are cultural tools that equip students with appropriate cultural capital to conceptualize knowledge and enhance academic performance, academic achievement. It is a way of promoting academic achievement and also making sure that students feel that there is some sense of belongingness to what they are learning. There should be some kind of coordination between their lived experiences and what they learn in schools, universities, and colleges. Indigenous knowledges are anti-hegemonic because they're not being imposed by anybody. They are coming from the communities themselves, and they are also a colonizing tool that emancipates higher education, teachers, students, and this also emancipates them from mental and cognitive colonization. So the continued use of Western knowledges seems to colonize the mental and cognitive abilities of students. So these knowledges, if they are implemented, try to decolonize students as well as the higher education system itself. I'll take a quote from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who said, the continued use of Western knowledge or Europeanized or Eurocentric education, far from giving African people confidence in their reality, capacities to overcome obstacles, tends to make feel their inadequacies, their weakness, and their incapacities in the face of reality, and their inability to do anything about the conditions governing their lives. In other words, the continued use of Western education and Western knowledge doesn't liberate the African people. It actually takes away their confidence, makes them feel somehow inadequate in what they do. So when you take a community which utilizes Western knowledge, say take a rural community, how does that knowledge help in alleviating their problems? How does it promote their lived conditions or living conditions? So knowledge should be appropriate to the community, appropriate to the people for which it is meant. When you try to look at post-colonial higher education in Africa, it is not located in appropriate indigenous cultural habitats. What students learn is a kind of dissonance from their cultural practices, from their lived experiences. According to Wackett, he says that habitats refers to the way society becomes deposited in persons in the form of lasting dispositions or trained capacities and structured propensities to think, feel, and act in determinate ways, which then guide them. So without embedding knowledge in the African communities, African culture, then these propensities to think and to feel and act in determinate ways will not be achieved. So indigenous African knowledges are important in terms of learning that takes place in higher education, even in high schools and primary schools. Without using indigenous knowledges, both teachers and students are alienated to the mnemonic knowledge that forms the basis of best education curricula. So what a relationship to the knowledge that they learn do the students see? Do they see themselves as part of what they are learning, or they see that as alienating? So when you look at the content of higher education, Africa is mostly Western education. But the content of higher education is based on the so-called positivist and scientific knowledge, which dismisses indigenous knowledge as scientific. But the question is, what is science? Who defines what scientific knowledge is? Science is any form of knowledge that is applicable to the community in which it's used. Science is something that provides people with practicalities to improve the quality of their lives. So indigenous knowledges themselves, in the context of the African society, African communities, and the way they solve their problems is also a form of science. So the lived experiences that alienate and marginalize both African teachers and students are the form of content that you find in higher education that seems to be prevailing in higher education in Africa. It is also hegemonic knowledge that sometimes is based on biopiracy and appropriation of indigenous knowledge. Earlier on, I gave an example of what happened to Udia. That's biopiracy, where indigenous knowledge are being appropriated and used for so-called scientific knowledge or Western knowledge. So Western knowledge or education also provides with dominant knowledge that causes cultural dissonance, cultural ambiguity. So when students are learning something that is alien to their lived experiences, then it causes cultural dissonance, the separation between their lived experiences, what they learn. And there's that cultural ambiguity because what they see in their environment is not what is being presented in the therefore provides that kind of dissonance and cultural ambiguity. So when you talk of knowledge, whose knowledge is it? Knowledge is very subjective. The way knowledge is defined is very problematic and subjective. knowledge is perceived from the perspective of the knower. So what is knowledge depends on the people. It depends on the individuals who construct that body of knowledge and of ideas. And it also depends on the way they make use of that knowledge in their everyday life. So the term knowledge itself is very problematic. It defines and who legitimizes that knowledge, who validates knowledge. Often knowledge is defined in the form of scientific approaches that are used in Western education or Western sciences, which see knowledge as explicit and objective. Western institutionalized knowledge that seek exclusive monopoly over these resources and knowledges. In other words, according to Ngulube, he says Western institutionalized knowledges seek to be exclusive in the way that they're applied. And when they seek to be exclusive, they become a monopoly. And they monopolize other forms of knowledges. And they become the so-called scientific knowledge that is aspired by most higher education institutions. So if you look at the legacy of colonial higher education, you will find that it is very individualistic and it creates selfish attitudes. Therefore, it takes away the Ubuntu that we tend to promote in our communities. We do not promote individualism, but we promote a sense of communalism. Therefore, if knowledge becomes very individualistic and we pursue knowledge, purpose, personal gratification, then that destroys community life and communal relationships. And the legacy of colonial education also is seen in the high unemployment rates that you find in Africa, because the young people who leave colleges and universities have a high rate of unemployment, become idle and unproductive youth. Give an example of what is happening in Zimbabwe, where you have got a large pool of students who have left universities and colleges who are roaming the streets. I think so. It tends to promote unemployment, and it creates poverty and dependence on foreign means of survival. So the legacy of colonial higher education also is seen in the continuation of mental and knowledge colonization, where there is more of Western knowledge that you find in higher institutions of learning. And there's that loss of cultural identity, which I spoke earlier on when I talk of cultural dissonance and cultural ambiguity, which in turn might create cultural misfits. We can see this in what is happening to our youth today, who want to become the so-called yellow belts, because they are losing their cultural identity and want to be identified with other people or the personas of other people. So it becomes a kind of cultural misfit. So there's a kind of loss of identity, sense of meaning, as Maslow says, that it ends up in epistemological alienation. We are distanced from our community. We are distanced from what makes us people. We are distanced from the Ubuntu that binds people in Africa. So why do we need to decolonize post-colonial higher education? One, because we are saying indigenous cultural capital is very important in the learning of our students. And it is also important in providing space in higher education institutions. Education is an integral part of the culture and history of a local community. Therefore, it's our cultural capital as African people. It promotes meaningful learning and relevant, validated lived experiences, because there's that kind of coordinated learning experiences and the meaningfulness of learning that you find from the indigenous cultural capital, if it is part of learning. Therefore, it promotes meaningful learning. It builds critical thinking and promotes school performance and educational achievement. It also emancipates and empowers students from feelings of dehumanization, alienation, powerlessness, and hopelessness, because there's that kind of correlation between their experiences and what they are learning. As cultural capital, Indigenous knowledges also foster active teacher-student interactions, which enables students to develop their critical thinking skills. Also, decolonizing post-colonial higher education also provides students and even university teachers themselves with a cultural renaissance. It reinforces self-identities and the cultural identities that give students and teachers their pride. It recreates and reinvigorates cohesive and holistic community living because it's their knowledge. They identify with the knowledge. It also minimizes the effects of capitalist attitudes that shackle African students today. And cognitively, it also provides cultural values, past knowledge, and historical commemorations, which should be the foundations of African school curriculum. Decolonization also leads to democratic knowledge. In other words, there is value in our knowledge. There is that participation that comes from using indigenous knowledge. So participatory learning and the knowledge production is democratic learning. Education is the practice of freedom. So students should see and teachers should see the freedom that they get from learning their own African indigenous knowledge. It gives them power, it gives them the abilities to be productive in the learning process. So cultural knowledges emancipate individuals, communities, empowering the skills for active, productive participation in socio-economic development. So education is power to free people from misconceptions about certain types of knowledge, particularly misconceptions about African knowledges themselves, and misconceptions about the superiority of Western knowledges. And it also gives power to deconstruct the delegitimized and invalidated African knowledges, which were invalidated by colonialism. Indigenous knowledges should also be practiced using indigenous language. So I also argue that indigenous languages must also be an integral part of contemporary African politics of education in order to promote educational equity and social justice. So what is the role of university when it comes to indigenous knowledges? Universities and higher education in general are there to create, produce, and deconstruct institutionalized knowledge. So it is the role of the university to provide students with critical thinking so that they can be able to deconstruct institutionalized knowledge. They should be able to see that institutionalized knowledge is not a fixed form of knowledge. It's not the only form of knowledge available. It's not the only type of knowledge that they can access. There are various types of knowledges that are available. The role of universities is also to archive knowledge that is deemed productive to society, particularly so-called scientific knowledge. But the question is, whose knowledge? If we focus on the so-called scientific knowledge only, then what happens to the other forms of knowledge? What is the source of the knowledge that is found in the universities, that is archived knowledges, that is institutionalized? It is unquestionable that it is Western-derived knowledge that is alien to indigenous Africans, whose epistemological and ontological realities are marginalized by higher education in Africa. Higher education should be able to collect, decode, and codify and archive knowledge for future access. That means even indigenous knowledges, they need to be collected, they need to be decoded, they need to be codified, and they need to be archived for future access. We know that if knowledge is not archived, it's not written, it's not recorded somewhere, it might tend to die. So it's important that we keep African knowledge accessible and we have them accessible to future students and future leaders as well, including future communities. So the role of higher education is also one, research and develop knowledge and disseminate that knowledge. They should be able to bioprospect knowledges, go out into the communities, collect information, collect data, collect even if there are herbs that should be collected, and this should be processed in a systematic way, and the new sources of biological material from the ecological system should be investigated to see how they can help the communities. We know that they help communities, therefore there's need to research, develop them, and be able to disseminate that knowledge. The role of universities to also be to research on indigenous plants and the herbs to fight diseases. I think we are currently being challenged by COVID-19, and there are processes throughout the world to investigate and to find ways of developing vaccines and possibly to find if it come up with treatment for the disease. And I'm happy to hear that there is collaboration between the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the University of Technologies, which are going to be the first ever to carry a first ever scientific study of herbs in fighting COVID-19. And I believe Professor Mamoon Salman is leading that investigation. I read and saw this on television, on ENCA television, and what surprised me was the headline which said, African herbs get a nod. Then I said, nod? Who gives the nod? Who validates that this should be done? Who legitimizes that certain forms of knowledge should be conducted? So there is a problem in Africa that whenever we are carrying out studies that focus on African herbs, someone else somewhere has to validate knowledge. In this case, I thought maybe WHO is validating, WHO is validating the research. Are these Western scientists who are validating the research? So, but the good thing is that there is a study that's going to be conducted, the scientific study that agrees that African herbs can be used in fighting COVID. And I hope we'll be able to read and find out what happens with this study. So research, development, and dissemination also focus on knowledge quantification and knowledge documentation to promote the dissemination just to reach out to different people who make use of knowledge itself. And I also found that in South Africa, the National Research Foundation has made Indigenous knowledge one of its focus areas in collaboration with the Department of Arts, Culture, Science, and Technology. And there is a lot, I think, that's going on in South Africa in trying to promote Indigenous knowledges. And I appreciate that. And one other way the role of the university could be, or higher education could play, is to develop research centers at universities and colleges. Research centers can be dedicated to the study of indigenous sciences. For example, there could be a research center that focuses on development of herbs, collection of herbs, and there could be also institutes on the development or of the development of indigenous knowledges that could also look at food security or food insecurity in Africa, focusing on how indigenous knowledges can be used to alleviate food security. There could be also studies that can look at the importance of wetlands in sustaining the agricultural activities that happen in Africa and protecting wetlands because they also provide access to water, access to food in terms of fisheries. So institutes of the development or study of African indigenous knowledges could be something that can be done in higher education, in universities, and in colleges. Universities can also form alliances, allyships with indigenous elders, herbalists, but they should also protect the intellectual property and rights of indigenous people. So when you use indigenous elders as allies or communities as allies, then there would be the protection of intellectual property that belongs to the indigenous communities. So indigenous elders are the heart and soul of indigenous communities, so they must play an important role in higher education. Elders are leaders, they are teachers, they are mentors, they are healers within their communities who provide the same functions as advisors. They are also doctors, they are also professors, there's what knowledges that they have that they share with their communities. So one way of promoting indigenous knowledges in universities is to create a position within higher education institutions, an elder in residence position, where an elder is kept at or is employed or is given space in higher education institutions. And the role of these elders would be to provide a cultural perspective to the teaching that goes on in universities. And they also can be used as resources to provide with appropriate knowledge and to direct researchers to communities where they can get the resources that they want in their researches. And elders can become also collaborators in the researches that are conducted. This will protect the knowledge from being colonized and from being appropriated. So I think the creation of an elder in residence is something that this is implementing. This has been done in Canada, where universities like Laurier has got an elder in residence, and that elder in residence has got a position which is similar to that of a professor, and they are given their space to carry out researches within their communities. They are given space to work with professors here when professors want to know more about indigenous knowledges and want to be directed towards resources that can help them understand indigenous knowledges better. Another role of higher education is to provide students with an inclusive curriculum. And this inclusive curriculum should be across all disciplines. In other words, all disciplines must have African indigenous knowledge in them. So having an inclusive curriculum means that it promotes the visibility of indigenous knowledge. Every discipline, even English, could have an indigenous perspective in it. Storytelling, for instance, it can focus on how indigenous people tell their stories, tell stories about how they live in their communities, tell stories about how their communities survive. So all subjects, all disciplines should promote indigenous knowledge. This promotes social justice in the distribution of the so-called privileged knowledge. So there's also the need for universities to collaborate with other stakeholders. This can be done through promotion of indigenous knowledge translation through the media, for instance. And I watch Anchor, ENCA, and Newsroom Africa, and I have seen a lot of newscasters or broadcasters bringing in traditional healers. For instance, recently I heard that ENCA is going to have a program that focuses on promoting traditional healers, and they are going to ask traditional healers to come to their studio and talk about their work. That's one way of translating indigenous knowledges. And I also saw a program where a Sangoma was presented. The Sangoma was casting bonds to predict a team that was going to win the soccer league in South Africa. So I thought it was very interesting. So I think it's a promotion of indigenous knowledges and indigenous people and their way of life that's being done. But we should also be careful that when this is being done, when Sangomas, traditional healers are being presented in the media, they are not being used as symbols of cultural spectacle or weird signs, but they are then regarded, they should be regarded as contributors to community knowledge and other ways of reading the ecological world in which we live. So in conclusion, I can say that as African indigenous scholars and researchers, we should aim at continuously decolonizing and disrupting the false superiority of Western defined knowledge sciences and promote indigenous knowledges and sciences as part of the curriculum in schools, as part of the space that's created in higher education. African indigenous sciences and indigenous scientists matter, their knowledges matter. Universities should avoid trivializing indigenous sciences, but celebrate their important contribution to people's lives and the way of life in Africa, and be made a tool of decolonized university knowledges and so-called university scientific science or scientific knowledges. Thank you.